Journalists and experts still poring over the millions of new Epstein files released under the law that Congress forced through.
And the chairman of a prominent law firm is stepping down over his association with Jeffrey Epstein.
This story doesn't start with a mansion, a jet, or an island. It starts with 12 women. Not rumors, not anonymous claims, not speculation. According to public court records and FBI case files, at least 12 women gave formal statements over a span of 14 years.
I was 16 years old.
I was 16.
17. 14 years old.
Describing abuse, coercion, and exploitation connected to Jeffrey Epstein. They spoke, they reported, they documented what happened to them. And then they waited. Some were teenagers when they first came forward. Others were young adults who believed that telling the truth would trigger protection, investigation, or at the very least, oversight. What the records show is not silence from the victims. It's silence after. The first statements were not made in 2019. They weren't a sudden wave. They appeared years earlier, logged in interviews, affidavits, and investigative notes. Each account was treated as a separate incident. Each one entered a system designed to process cases individually, not as a connected pattern. That distinction mattered, because when stories are isolated, urgency fades. When timelines are fragmented, accountability weakens. And when responsibility is spread across agencies, no one owns the outcome. The FBI files don't show that these women were ignored outright. They show something more complicated and more dangerous. They show that the information was received, but never assembled. Statements were taken, reports were filed, notes were archived, but no sustained mechanism existed to track what happened next to the people who spoke up. Did oversight increase? Did monitoring begin? Did protections follow? The records don't show a consistent answer. What they do show is time passing. Years in which Epstein continued to travel. Years in which properties remained active. Years in which the infrastructure around him stayed intact. For the women who came forward, the aftermath was often quiet. Some were contacted once and never again. Some were told the case was under review. Others saw no visible action at all. The system didn't push back against their credibility. It simply didn't move. This video isn't about graphic detail. It isn't about sensationalizing harm. And it isn't about assigning blame beyond what the record supports. It's about what happens after someone reports abuse, when the system is supposed to respond. Because when people ask why this case lasted so long, the files point to a hard truth. The warnings didn't fail to exist. They failed to connect. 12 women spoke. 14 years passed. And protection never arrived in a way that matched the scale of what was reported. Understanding that gap matters, not just for this case, but for every system that relies on victims to speak first and institutions to act second. After the statements were given, most of the women expected something to change. Not immediately, not dramatically, but something. According to court records and publicly released investigative materials, what followed for many of them was not retaliation. It was absence. No follow-up interviews, no status updates, no clear explanation of what would happen next. Several women later described the same pattern. Once their statement was taken, communication slowed, then stopped. The system didn't tell them their reports were false. It didn't tell them they weren't believed. It simply went quiet. In the files, this period is difficult to track because there is so little activity recorded. Long gaps appear between notes. Months turn into years without documented escalation. Complaints remain logged, but not revisited as a group. Each woman's experience was processed in isolation. That isolation had consequences. Without a unified review, no one was tasked with asking the obvious questions. Why are similar accounts appearing years apart? Why do the same locations keep coming up? Why does the same individual remain unrestricted? Instead, responsibility fractured. Local authorities handled local reports. Federal agencies reviewed federal jurisdiction. Civil attorneys pursued civil remedies. None of these paths converged into a single, sustained protective response. For the women, that fragmentation felt like dismissal, even when it wasn't intended to be. Some continued with their lives, assuming the system was working behind the scenes. Others watched as nothing visibly changed. A few tried to speak again, only to be told their information was already on file. On file meant archived. Archived meant inactive. The FBI records show no coordinated victim support mechanism that followed these women over time. No consistent outreach. No long-term case ownership. Once a report was logged, the burden quietly shifted away from the institution and back onto the individual. That shift matters because reporting abuse requires trust. Trust that speaking will lead to protection, accountability, or at least acknowledgement. When that trust isn't met with visible action, silence becomes safer than persistence. What's most striking is that none of this required new evidence to change. The accounts already existed, the names already appeared, the timelines already overlapped. What was missing was continuity. The system didn't collapse under pressure. It stalled under routine. And for the women who had already taken the hardest step, speaking publicly, the absence of response became its own form of harm. Not because they were disbelieved, but because they were left waiting in a system that never clearly told them what waiting meant. When the accounts are laid side by side, the pattern is difficult to miss, but they were never laid side by side. According to FBI files and court records, the women's statements shared overlapping details, locations, time frames, methods of contact, elements that, when connected, should have triggered escalation. Instead, they remained compartmentalized, each treated as a standalone report rather than part of a broader picture. This wasn't a lack of information, it was a lack of synthesis. Investigative systems are designed to identify patterns when enough data accumulates, but that only works when someone is assigned to connect the dots over time. In this case, the files show no permanent tasking to do exactly that. Reports were logged under different case numbers. Jurisdictions differed. Some statements entered federal systems, others remained local. Civil filings existed separately from criminal investigations. Each track moved forward or stalled independently. What never happened was consolidation. The women's experiences weren't compared across years. No central review evaluated similarities in recruitment methods, property usage, or travel behavior. Without that consolidation, each report seemed smaller than it actually was. The pattern was there. The system never assembled it. This fragmentation also affected urgency. A single report can be delayed. A pattern demands action. But when reports are siloed, urgency never accumulates. The files show no moment where all known statements were reviewed together prior to 2019. No unified assessment. No cross-agency briefing focused solely on victim accounts as a collective warning. Instead, oversight relied on thresholds that were never clearly defined. How many reports were enough? Over how many years? From how many jurisdictions? Without clear criteria, the system defaulted to inertia. What makes this especially troubling is that the accounts didn't contradict each other. They reinforced one another. But reinforcement requires visibility. For the women involved, this meant their voices remained isolated echoes, instead of a chorus loud enough to force response. The result wasn't disbelief. It was dilution. Each account lost weight because it stood alone, even though together they described a consistent and escalating risk. This is the core failure the FBI files reveal. Not ignorance, not malice, but a system that treats repetition as coincidence when it lacks structure to recognize patterns across time. And once pattern recognition fails, protection fails with it. What finally forced the accounts into a single investigation wasn't a new allegation. It was convergence. According to court records and FBI documentation, the shift happened when multiple pressures arrived at the same time. Civil litigation discovery, renewed media scrutiny, internal reviews, and victim statements that could no longer be kept separate without creating obvious contradictions. Individually, none of these elements were unprecedented. Together, they made fragmentation impossible to maintain. Civil cases played a critical role. During discovery, records that had lived in different silos were requested side by side. Flight logs alongside property records, victim statements alongside travel timelines. What had once appeared disconnected suddenly shared the same coordinates. Locations overlapped, dates aligned, movement patterns repeated. This wasn't speculation, it was correlation. At that point, investigators could no longer treat each account as an isolated incident without ignoring their own documentation. The pattern became visible, not because it was newly created, but because it was finally assembled. The FBI files indicate that once this consolidation occurred, the response accelerated quickly. Investigative priorities shifted, jurisdictional barriers were lowered. Evidence that had existed for years was re-evaluated with context it had never been given before. But timing mattered. By the time this unified review took place, years had passed since the earliest statements. During those years, oversight mechanisms had expired, attention had drifted, and opportunities for early intervention had been lost. The system didn't change because it learned something new. It changed because it was forced to look at everything at once. This is the moment where the failure becomes clear in hindsight. Had consolidation occurred earlier, had there been a standing requirement to review all related accounts together, escalation could have happened sooner. Instead, the process waited for outside pressure to do what internal structures should have done automatically. Once the case re-entered full federal focus, action followed. Arrests were pursued. Assets were secured. The infrastructure that had enabled continued movement was finally disrupted. But the women who had spoken years earlier saw this unfold long after their initial reports. For them, the shift wasn't vindication. It was confirmation that the system had always held the pieces. It just hadn't put them together. What the record ultimately shows is not a mystery solved at the last moment. It shows a system that acted late, not blind. The consequences that did occur are clear and documented. In 2019, Epstein was arrested on federal charges. His properties were seized. His movements stopped. The infrastructure that had allowed him to operate was finally dismantled. And in court, accountability did arrive, but narrowly. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted after a jury trial and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for her role in recruiting and exploiting victims. That sentence stands. It is the most concrete legal outcome tied directly to the harm described in the files. For the women who spoke publicly, that mattered, but it didn't answer everything. Because the files also confirm what never happened. There was no comprehensive review of the system failures that allowed the reports to sit for years without consolidation. No permanent oversight mechanism was created to ensure that once a pattern is identified, it remains monitored beyond headlines and court dates. There was no unified accountability for the gap between the first statements and the final arrest. That gap is the central lesson. 12 women spoke. 14 years passed. And the response only became decisive when fragmentation collapsed under its own weight. This doesn't diminish the courage of those who came forward. It underscores it. They did what systems depend on individuals to do. Report harm, tell the truth, put their experiences on record. The failure was not theirs. It belonged to the structures that treated repetition as coincidence and time as resolution. The FBI files don't accuse unnamed people. They don't speculate. They document process. And process is where prevention either works or doesn't. If there is accountability to be drawn from this case, it's not only in convictions. It's in how institutions handle information once it's been entrusted to them. Oversight cannot expire. Patterns must be assembled, not archived. Protection has to follow testimony, not wait for convergence. That's what the records make plain. And that's why this story matters beyond one name, one case, or one outcome. If you want more investigations like this, grounded in documents, centered on people, and clear about what changed and what didn't, subscribe. Because the most important question isn't what happened once. It's whether the system is prepared to act the next time someone speaks up.